The sun rose slowly over the land of Egypt, but its light no longer meant freedom. What once had been a place of refuge for the descendants of Jacob had become a kingdom of chains. The rivers still flowed, the temples still gleamed, and Pharaoh's banners still danced in the wind, but beneath that grandeur the cries of the Israelites echoed in secret. They had once walked in the favour of kings. Now they bent beneath the whips of masters. Generations had come and gone since the days of Joseph. The memory of the dreamer who saved Egypt had faded into legend, his name remembered only in the whispers of old men who still clung to stories around dim fires. But pharaohs had no use for memory. They built monuments to themselves, not to the past. And so when the throne passed to a new ruler, one who did not know Joseph, the balance between gratitude and greed was lost forever. Brick by brick, Israel's strength was drained into the walls of Pharaoh's pride. The same hands that once gathered grain to feed a starving world now moulded mud beneath an unforgiving sun. Every blow of the taskmaster's rod was a reminder of how far they had fallen. Hope, once their inheritance, was now a forbidden word. But faith has a way of surviving where hope seems impossible. It lingers, hidden, not in power, but in the hearts that still whisper prayers no one hears. In the quiet corners of Goshen, mothers sang lullabies not of Egypt's gods, but of a promise older than pyramids, a promise made to Abraham, renewed to Isaac, and carried through Jacob, that one day their children would no longer be strangers in a foreign land. Years became decades, and decades turned into centuries. Slavery became not a punishment, but a way of life. The people forgot what freedom felt like, and yet, deep inside, something ancient still stirred, a longing, a restlessness, a memory of a covenant. The Egyptians saw only numbers and labour. Heaven saw a nation in the making. There were nights when the stars over Goshen seemed to burn brighter, as if some unseen watcher still marked their suffering. The elders would point upward and say, "The same stars Abraham counted still shine," and in that fragile hope, the embers of faith refused to die. But faith is not forged in comfort. It grows in silence, in waiting, in the long years where God seems far away. Egypt's power expanded while Israel's spirit thinned. Every child born under Hebrew blood was a quiet act of defiance, a protest against Pharaoh's decree that life itself was treason. Still they birthed, they built, they buried, and they believed. Because even when God seems silent, his plans are already moving in the shadows. And so it was that one day, amid the cries of women and the clash of soldiers, a single child drew his first breath. He was born into fear, wrapped in destiny. His mother held him close, her heart torn between love and terror. Outside, soldiers patrolled the streets, their eyes sharp, their swords ready to make examples of disobedience. In those days, Pharaoh had decreed that every newborn Hebrew boy be cast into the Nile. The river that had once brought life to Egypt now carried the bodies of the innocent. It was a godless obedience, a ritual of cruelty. But faith, once again, found a way. The mother hid her child for as long as she could, hiding his cries beneath blankets, praying every footstep outside would pass her door. But time, like the tide, cannot be stopped. And so, when hiding became impossible, she did something unthinkable. She built a small basket, woven from reeds sealed with pitch, and laid her son inside. The Nile that devoured others would now be his cradle. She let go, tears falling into the water that would carry him away. The river moved softly, as if even it felt the weight of that sacrifice. The basket drifted between reeds, past crocodiles and fishermen, past life and death alike, guided by hands unseen. And somewhere down the current, beneath the palace walls, where marble met the edge of the river, a daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe. The basket caught her eye, and the cry of the child broke through the noise of her attendants. The future had entered the house of the oppressor. What began as a mother's desperation became divine orchestration. The same river Pharaoh had chosen for death became God's instrument for deliverance. The princess took the child in her arms, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt compassion. Perhaps it was the innocence in his eyes, or perhaps heaven itself reached through her heart. She named him Moses, for he was drawn out of the water, and though Egypt would raise him, heaven would claim him. Years passed. The boy who should have drowned became a prince among those who ordered his death. He walked the marble halls of Egypt, learned the language of power, and wore the garments of royalty. But beneath the silk, his soul belonged to another people. He looked at his reflection in polished bronze, and saw both worlds staring back, one of privilege, one of pain. The palace had given him everything but peace. As he grew, the cries from the fields reached his ears, the groans of men beaten beneath the same sun that warmed his gardens, and something in him began to break. The walls of Egypt could no longer keep out the truth of his blood. One day his conscience erupted like a storm. He saw an overseer strike a slave until the man could no longer stand. The sight was unbearable. Rage, long suppressed, found its release. When the sand settled, one man was dead, and another's destiny had begun to shift. But even righteous anger has consequences. The same city that once bowed to him now whispered his name with fear. Rumors spread, and Pharaoh's wrath followed. Moses fled, leaving behind the only life he'd ever known. The desert received him like a grave. He walked for days, then weeks, his royal sandals torn, his skin burned, his heart hollowed by guilt and confusion. The man who had been called prince now wandered nameless. There is a kind of silence that only the desert can teach, a silence so deep it strips away every illusion. No court, no crown, no command, only the wind and the whisper of one's own thoughts. The wilderness does not care who you were, it only reveals who you are. In that vast emptiness, Moses found refuge among shepherds, men who spoke little and lived close to the earth. He tended their flocks, learning the rhythm of solitude, the patience of stillness, the humility of waiting. 40 years passed. The same hands that once gripped a scepter now guided sheep. Each sunrise looked the same, and yet, within the monotony, something unseen was being shaped. Because God does not waste the desert, he uses it to carve prophets from princes. The desert has its own language. It speaks not through words, but through absence. The absence of noise, of comfort, of answers. For 40 years Moses listened to that silence. Each dawn began the same, the slow crawl of light over stone, the sigh of wind through the hills, the bleating of sheep wandering toward a horizon that never changed. He had long stopped asking questions. Perhaps that was the point. The man who once sought justice with his own hands had learned that even passion, without purpose, turns to dust. He had come to accept the wilderness, its loneliness, its unending sameness, as his inheritance. And yet, the wilderness is not a place of abandonment. it is the forge where God shapes the unseen. Each step Moses took left no mark on the shifting sands, but heaven was tracing his path all along. Every breath of wind that brushed his face, every night the stars pierced the dark like 1,000 eyes. They were reminders that though man may forget his calling never forgets him. It was on an ordinary morning that the extraordinary appeared. Moses led his flock across the backside of Mount Horeb, a place so barren that even shadows had no patience to linger. The stones were sharp beneath his sandals, the air was dry and still. The sheep scattered, grazing among the rocks, and then he saw it. A single bush, small and thorned, burning with a fire that did not consume. At first he thought it was a trick of the sun, the way heat bends light into illusion. But as he drew closer, the glow did not fade. It pulsed, alive, breathing. The flames moved like thought, deliberate, calm, as though aware of being watched. Something ancient stirred in the air. The breeze that moments ago had been lifeless now carried a weight, an unseen presence pressing against his skin. The ground beneath him seemed to hum, a low vibration that travelled up through his feet into his chest. Time itself slowed. The world fell away until there was only the fire and his trembling heart. Felt it before he understood it, that this moment was not meant to be explained, but to be endured. The fire was not like any he had known. It gave off no smoke, no ash, no scent of burning, and yet, within it, there was power, not violent, but absolute. It was as if eternity had chosen this single shrub in a forgotten desert to reveal what no palace could contain. Moses fell to his knees, not out of ritual, but because the weight of that presence drove every argument, every doubt, every memory of Egypt from his soul. He had lived among gods of stone and gold, but this was something else, something alive, something that looked straight through him and found the boy hidden beneath the man. The fire did not roar, it whispered, but in that whisper creation itself seemed to tremble. There was no language for what he felt. 1,000 lifetimes of silence could not prepare a man for the moment heaven bends low enough to touch the earth. And then understanding came, not as words, but as a knowing that filled him like light. The fire was not calling for awe, it was calling for surrender. He removed his sandals. The sand was cool beneath his feet. Every grain felt alive, as if even the ground itself recognized the presence of something holy. The desert, which had once seemed empty, now overflowed with meaning. The wind, the rocks, the stillness, they all existed within that moment's sacred hush. Moses realized he was standing on holy ground, and holiness, he understood, is not a place. It is the presence of God breaking through the ordinary. In that revelation, something shifted within him. The years of exile, the guilt of his past, the weight of his failure, they no longer felt like punishment. They were preparation, because the wilderness had not been a place of hiding, but a classroom. Each silent day had been a lesson in humility, each night under the stars a reminder of smallness. And now the teacher had revealed himself. There are moments when purpose does not arrive as opportunity, but as interruption. And when it comes, it does not ask for readiness, only obedience. Moses stood before the fire for what felt like eternity. He could not look away, and yet he could not bear to see. The light revealed both beauty and fear, and in its glow he saw the truth. That man is dust, and yet somehow God chooses to breathe through that dust. He felt unworthy. He felt small. But perhaps smallness was the doorway all along, for only the broken can truly carry the weight of divine purpose. The wind began to stir again. The fire burned as before, steady, patient, alive. And though Moses could not hear words, he understood the meaning that filled the silence, that the God who had seemed absent had been walking beside him all these years, in Egypt, in exile, in every step across the sands. The silence had not been God's neglect, it had been his invitation. For what is faith, if not believing that even in the absence of miracles, the miracle is still unfolding? From that moment, Moses was no longer the same. The desert around him had not changed, but he had. He walked back through the valleys with slower steps, not because he was tired, but because he had begun to see holiness in everything, in every gust of wind, in every stone, in every heartbeat of the sheep he tended. The fire had not left him. It burned now within, invisible but unquenchable. For when a man has seen the presence of God, even the ordinary becomes sacred. The days that followed were quieter, yet filled with a strange expectancy. He no longer fought his isolation, he embraced it. Because solitude is where God often begins his greatest works. The sun rose and set as before, but the light felt different. Each morning, as he lifted his eyes toward the horizon, he felt the weight of unseen purpose pressing gently upon his soul. In the stillness, Moses began to understand something he never had in Egypt, that deliverance is not the act of escaping suffering, but the act of finding meaning within it. Egypt had taught him to act. The desert had taught him to wait. And now, heaven had taught him to listen. When the time came, he would know what to do, not because he had found courage, but because he had found trust. For the first time in 40 years, he was no longer running, not from Pharaoh, not from his past, not even from himself. He had been found by the same God who had watched him drift down the Nile as a child, who had led him through exile, and who now called him through fire. Purpose, like the desert wind, cannot be seen, but it shapes everything it touches. The wind changed long before the man did. In the stillness of the desert, the same breeze that once whispered solitude now carried a new rhythm, the rhythm of calling. The fire on Horeb had faded, but its echo lived within Moses like a second heartbeat. Each dawn, as he watched the horizon ignite with light, he knew the time of waiting was ending. The quiet had done its work. It is a strange thing when the moment you have run from all your life finds you ready to walk toward it. The sheep wandered. The hills stood silent, and somewhere beyond those sands lay the empire that had forgotten compassion, the land that had made him both prince and fugitive. Egypt, the wound and the beginning. He did not know what awaited him there, but purpose does not ask for certainty, it asks for surrender. The journey back was long, and each step was a conversation between fear and faith. The desert that had once hidden him now became his path forward. He no longer feared its emptiness, for he had learned that emptiness is not void, it is invitation. The sun sank behind him as he crossed the border of memory. The same Nile that had carried him as a child now shimmered in the distance, its waters reflecting the fire that once burned on a mountain. The city still stood, proud, unyielding, gilded with cruelty, but something unseen was already unravelling within it. Empires fall not when their walls crack, but when heaven withdraws its silence. The days that followed would become legend, signs and wonders that defied nature, a contest not between men but between pride and mercy. Moses did not seek to be a hero. He only obeyed, one act at a time, carrying the weight of faith that often looked like foolishness. There were moments when even he doubted, when the heavens stayed quiet after his pleas, when the people murmured against him, when Pharaoh's heart seemed made of stone. But faith is not proven by ease. It is refined by endurance. Night after night, the sky over Egypt filled with signs. Darkness that swallowed the sun, rivers that ran red, storms that split the horizon. Yet even then, the greatest miracle was not in the plagues, but in the patience of God, who gave men every chance to soften before breaking. Moses watched as power crumbled under its own arrogance. He had seen palaces rise, and now he saw them tremble before a force that could not be named. The same man who once fled from blood now stood before kings, not by might, but by obedience. And when, at last, the night of freedom came, it came not with triumph, but with stillness. There was no sound, only the faint rustle of sandals in the dark, the whisper of children being carried, the muted crackle of torches moving through the desert wind. A people long enslaved were walking into promise. Behind them, Egypt slept uneasily, its monuments looming like shadows of a forgotten glory. Before them stretched the wilderness, a land as harsh as the chains they had left, and yet filled with the breath of something new. Freedom rarely begins with comfort. It begins with uncertainty. They moved as one, a river of souls flowing through the night, drawn by faith more than direction. Some looked back, fearing pursuit. Others looked up, searching for the stars that Abraham once counted. And somewhere near the front, a man walked with a staff in his hand, his face weathered by time and revelation. He had no crown, no army, no plan beyond obedience, but he carried the fire within him still, not to destroy, but to guide. When the dawn broke, the Red Sea stood before them, endless, deep, impassable. Behind them, the dust of Pharaoh's chariots darkened the horizon. The people panicked. The air thickened with fear. And yet Moses did not waver. He had learned long ago that the same God who appears in fire can also command the waters. He raised his staff, and the wind that had carried the scent of death shifted to the scent of deliverance. The sea stirred. Waves lifted and curled, but instead of crashing, they held as though invisible hands had divided the deep. What followed was not a roar, but a whisper, the sound of obedience meeting eternity. The waters rose, like walls, and the path opened, shimmering beneath the moonlight. They walked step after trembling step, their reflections moving across the surface of what once was their grave. The sea did not close until the last foot had crossed, until the last child had reached the far shore. Then, as dawn bled across the horizon, the waters returned, swift, final, merciful. Silence followed, a silence unlike any they had known before, not the silence of waiting, but the silence of awe. Moses stood on the other side, his breath heavy with wonder. The sea that had threatened to drown them now lay calm, its surface smooth as glass, as if it too was resting from what it had witnessed. He looked upon the people, their faces lit by mourning, their eyes filled with disbelief and gratitude. And for the first time he understood the pattern woven through his life. Every exile, every failure, every long night of silence, all had been threads in a story far greater than himself. He was not the author, only the witness. Freedom was not the end. It was the beginning of another desert, another waiting, another faith to be learned. But for this moment, this breath between bondage and promise, the world was still. The sun rose higher, turning the sea into a mirror of gold. The sound of waves became like a heartbeat, steady and eternal. And in that rhythm, Moses finally found peace. He had once believed that God's presence was in miracles, in fire, in wind, in parted seas. But now, standing in the quiet after deliverance, he knew the truth, that the greatest miracle was that God had never left at all. He had been there in the river that carried him, in the palace that confused him, in the desert that broke him, in the fire that called him, and in the silence that sustained him. The journey was never about reaching a destination. It was about discovering a presence. And so, as the people moved forward into the wilderness, the man who once doubted his worth became the voice of a nation's hope. The shepherd had become a guide. The exile had become a prophet. The broken had become a vessel. Behind him, the sea glimmered like a closing chapter. Before him, the desert stretched, empty yet alive, waiting once more to teach, to test, to refine. He breathed deeply, and the air tasted of promise. The fire that once spoke from a bush now spoke from within, and though he knew the path ahead would be long, he also knew this, that the God who parts seas is the same God who walks beside us long after the waters close. If this story stirred something within you, if it reminded you that even silence has meaning, share it with someone who needs to remember that God still speaks, even through fire, through waiting, through the wilderness. And if you believe that every story of faith deserves to live again, like, share, and subscribe to the Bible Weaver, where ancient voices still whisper hope into the noise of our time.